mammal captivity issue, and the question of whether we can move forward together instead of apart. So I want to explore 3 questions with you today. First of all, who are cetaceans? Who are they? Do they thrive in captivity? And what should we do about what we know about them? 3 apparently simple questions. I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'm going to put it right up front. And tell you that my conclusion from working in this area for many, many years is that, first of all, the years of scientific research done both in captivity and in the field have revealed much about who dolphins and whales are. There's no doubt about the fact that captive research has revealed a tremendous amount about who these creatures are. And the empirical research leads to the inescapable conclusion that cetacean nature is fundamentally incompatible with captivity. Cetaceans cannot thrive in captivity. And I emphasize the word thrive because it's not the same as survive, it's not the same as live, it's not the same as eat, it's not even the same as reproduce. Thrive means something very particular. It means the ability to prosper, to flourish, to have a rich life with all its ups and downs. And my conclusion is that that is impossible. All good intentions are not aside for cetaceans. So let's take a look at who cetaceans are. Now that's a pretty broad kind of statement to make because there's so many different species and it's a wide range of species differences. But I do think that there are some fundamental characteristics of cetaceans that characterize them. And in particular, those that are used most often in the captivity industry, the beluga whale, the bottlenose dolphin, and the orca. Well, first of all, cetaceans are wide-ranging. They're adapted to traveling and diving. Take a look at that. They're intelligent, aware, and autonomous. And they are socially both interdependent and complex. So let's look at the first. What can I say? They like to move. Cetaceans are adapted to moving, traveling, diving, hunting, foraging. There's really little to be said about this because of the enormity of the scientific evidence, and it's self-evident. We have orcas that dive to depths of 100 to 200 meters when foraging, traveling over 100 miles a day, belugas traveling thousands of kilometers in a few months, and bottlenose dolphins ranging over 85 square miles. I think that is pretty self-evident. So let's get to the second part, intelligence, awareness, and autonomy. Well, I studied the brains of dolphins and whales for about 20 years, 25 years now. One of my colleagues, Sam Ridgway, is in the audience. And I'm here to tell you that my conclusion from studying these brains is that these animals possess the neurobiological goods which underlie complex intelligence. This is the brain of an adult orca. And cetacean brains are characterized by 3 things. 1, they're large. They're large relative to the body size. And that has some relation to cognitive complexity. They have an expanded neocortex, which you see here, the wrinkled outer part of the brain, particularly in areas that have not been labeled primary motor and sensory cortex. And they have a highly differentiated neocortical cytoarchitecture. In other words, that brain is complex, it is not just large and simple. And there's an enormous amount of peer-reviewed scientific evidence to support this. Now, the old way of looking at cetacean brains used to be, yeah, they're large, but they're kind of simple, just a big ball of mush. Some people thought that they were just a big ball of glial cells. Some people still think that. But in fact, we know that there's considerable complexity in the way the cells are put together and in the types of cells that are in the cortex of dolphin and whale brains. And in 2005, my colleague Patrick Hoff and I, as well as Janice, came to the conclusion that the present evidence for considerable complexity in cetacean neocortex, coupled with the large size, is entirely consistent with the large body of evidence for behavioral and social complexity in cetaceans. So, we all know the bottlenose dolphin. I've worked with the bottlenose dolphin. Here are just a few things we know about this animal. Well, we know that they're capable of recognizing themselves in a mirror. And my colleague Diana Reese and I demonstrated that in 2001. This animal is also capable of recording on his own thoughts, capable of metacognition. In other words, thinking about thinking, something we all do. We think about how we feel, how certain we are about things, and in fact, bottlenose dolphins are capable of doing the same thing and reporting on it. They're aware of their own body and their own body parts and how they correspond to parts of our body. They understand symbolic communication system. They imitate, they plan ahead, they innovate, they use tools. Let's take a look at the social complexity of some of these dolphins and whales. This is a visual representation of the complexity of social networks among bottlenose dolphins at Mammal. Now, I'm not going to unpack all of this for you. It's mainly to give you the visual sense of just how complex these associations are. What you do to make a map like that is you follow individuals over time and you figure out who's who and then who hangs out with who, how much time they spend together, who's important in the social network, what are the social roles of each of the individuals, and one of the really important take-home messages from the work of people like Brenda McCallum and David Rousseau on social network analysis is the following, that all you have to do is pluck the right individual out of the social network, and the whole thing can unravel. Okay? So these are not just gregarious animals. They have a social infrastructure that needs to be kept in place in order for all of them to thrive. When we look at orchids, we know that they have cultural traditions based upon different dialects and foraging strategies. They engage in cooperative hunting. They resource partition. They have often lifelong social bonds. Many populations are matrilineal with post-reproductive lifespans, which tells you something about the fact that even post-reproduction, the matrilineal situation is very important to pass on learning. And they have very complex social networks. Okay. So that is just a brief overview of who cetaceans are fundamentally by nature. We want to summarize this by simply asking the question, what do cetaceans need in order to thrive? 1, they need to move. 2, they need a varied physical environment. 3, they need personal space. They need to have room to get away from each other when they want to. They need to exercise control over their lives. And they need to be challenged in different ways. And this is very important, the notion of being challenged, which I will return to. Their intellect requires that they live a challenging life. They need social opportunities to bond, to relate, to interact, to reproduce, etc., to learn from each other, etc., etc. And they also need a social infrastructure. In other words, they need intact family ties. Whatever their infrastructure is in the wild, that is the supportive network for who they are as individuals. Now, why are cetaceans like this? Well, I'm not being facetious when I say that it's really self-evident. Evolutionary adaptation to a set of specific selective pressures which shape them over tens of millions of years have made them who they are. Just as evolutionary history has made us who we are. And they have adapted to their own environment, both physically and socially, ecologically, for tens of millions of years. In fact, some of the species, like the bottlenose dolphin, have pretty much had their brains and their social ecology for at least 10 to 15 million years. And when you look at cetacean evolution from the time that they were land-dwelling animals through transitional forms to more modern forms, but extinct forms to the present, there is a tremendous evolutionary change that occurred in their body. And that change represents a change in social ecology, how you use the environment. It's not a change, it's how you eat also. And it also, as some of my colleagues and I have discovered, is a change that went along with changes in the inner ear bones, which means at some point that echolocation, high frequency capacities came into play while the brain was getting bigger and more complex. Speaking of the brain of dolphins and whales has changed considerably. In fact, I think it is the most dramatic change, evolutionary change, in neurology that we have an example of. When you go back and you look at the land-dwelling ancestors, 37, 40, 45, 50 million years ago, and even the early ones that went back into the water, the Archaeocenes, their brains were pretty average. And over time, we saw an increase in a way that led to the top right, bottlenose dolphin brain, which is an animal that, along with some other species, is the second most highly encephalized on the planet next to us, has a neocortex that is complex, highly gyrified, and has a lot of elements that, again, underlie complex cognition. So, that's who cetaceans are in terms of what they need to thrive, what their brains are like, what are some of the capacities we know that they have. The question is, do they thrive in captivity? It's an empirical question in my mind. Well, we know that many dolphins and whales simply have higher mortality rates in captivity than in the wild. And those of you that have seen this table from Naomi Rose's white paper are familiar with the fact that these statistics are what they are. And they come from a series of different studies that were done through the 80s and the 90s. Now, the thing that's important is to think about, well, okay, maybe since the 80s and 90s, captivity has gotten better. We've gotten better at husbandry. gotten better at taking care of these animals? Well, Dr. Rose and her colleagues recently gave a talk at the Society for Marine Mammalogy Conference in New Zealand, in which they took a look at orca welfare and survival pre-1993 and post. In other words, over the past 20 years, you would expect that husbandry practices would have increased survival rates. In fact, improved husbandry has had no impact on survival of captive orcas. We're not any better at keeping them alive today than we were in 1980. Additionally, captive-born orcas do not have any better chances of survival than those wild-caught. Now, when I look at this, I see a wall. I see a wall of incompatibility, an impasse that says this is not going to get better. The median life expectancy for captive orcas is 4 years, compared to a median survival time or life expectancy between 30 and 100 years, depending upon the sex and the population. There's a plethora of scientific evidence showing the psychological and physiological stress that captive cetaceans endure. And Tony Frohoff and I did a review of all of these papers in 2011 and published it in PLOS One, and I'd be happy to point you to that if you'd like more information, more specific information. The most common cause of death in orcas is infection. And a contributing factor is immunosuppression, which is caused by chronic stress. Now, this is not an idea that arose de novo. This is something I learned in college as a biopsychology student. This is the well-known HPA axis, the effect of stress, chronic stress, on the immune system. And that's a well-known process in humans, other mammals. There's a whole axis of hormonal change that occurs that makes changes in the body. If you're under chronic stress, at some point you're going to become compromised, you're going to get sick, and you're going to die. Now, in addition to the chronic stress, Jet Inventor recently pointed out that many infections in orcas could also be due to poor dental hygiene. It turns out that captive orcas wear down their teeth by grating them on gates, gnawing them on concrete, and because of that, their teeth break, and they are susceptible to sepsis, abscesses, bacteremia, just adding to the whole situation. Now, this is a slide that is near and dear to my heart, because this slide contains two individuals who actually made a big difference in my life. As I mentioned, we have learned a tremendous amount about dolphins from studies of captive dolphins. I am not going to deny that. My point is, do we keep going or move on? A lot of people are familiar with the work that I did with Diana Reese, showing that bottlenose dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors. You're also very familiar with the work of Lou Herman, who did tremendous work looking at symbolic language imitation in the dolphins in his lab. And I just wanted to give you an update on these captive research superstars. If this were a "Where Are They Now" session, the news would not be good. Presley and Tab who you see here, looking in the mirror, showed the ability to recognize themselves in mirrors. A couple of years later, they were transferred to other facilities, and they died. They died at 19 and 21 years of age. Presley of fungal encephalitis, Tab of gastroenteritis. I never did work in captivity again. Phoenix, Sakia Kamai, Alele, and Kiapo, all the research superstars from Lou Herman's lab, they all died in their 20s, a couple of them from untreated cancer, Alele from enteritis and toxemia. And the one on the lower right is one that you probably don't know. That's Natwa. He was down in Florida. This is the dolphin that showed that he could tell you whether he was certain about the answer to a question or trial. Metacognition. He died of hepatitis and cirrhosis at 18. In 2009, I did a review of these issues with Captain Stewart, and we came to the conclusion that many captive dolphins and whales display physiological and behavioral indicators of increased stress, including elevated stress hormones, behavioral stereotypies, self-mutilation, and excessive aggressiveness towards not only each other, but humans. And that comes as no surprise. Many of my colleagues here have found the same thing. So, I say to you that the evidence is overwhelming that cetaceans cannot thrive in captivity. It just doesn't work. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't work. It doesn't matter what your intentions are, it doesn't matter what you do. There's something fundamentally incompatible between who dolphins and whales are and what they can be offered in captivity. It's a simple empirical issue. And what's very interesting is, as I've thought about this, a lot of people look at the intelligence of dolphins and whales and think, well, intelligence could be a protective factor. In fact, a lot of people view it as a behavioral flexibility, as a basic, protective factor against the rigors of the outside world. But I would contend that rather than intelligence being a protective factor for dolphins and whales, it puts them in a particularly vulnerable situation. It is actually a risk factor. And when you consider the fact that these are individuals who have a sense of self, who know where they are, who are autonomous, and are aware of their situation, you can begin to understand how being in captivity is something that they cannot contend with. And I ask you a simple question. Under what circumstances would an animal thrive better in an artificial setting than one to which he or she is exquisitely adapted? And again, to quote Naomi and Parsons and Farinato, in response to the statement by the captivity industry that, well, dolphins and whales in human care have everything they need, great husbandry, veterinary care, we feed them, they don't have to go anywhere, they just have to open their mouth. And this is so much better than facing all of the horrors and rigors of a life in the wild, with pollution and people harassing them and so on and so forth. Well, that kind of argument flies right in the face of what we know about behavioral evolution, basic science. As Rose Parsons and Farinato say, to use the rigors of the wild as a justification for the conditions of captivity is misleading and disingenuous. This argument implies that the natural state is an evil to be avoided and that the captive environment is the preferred state. The suggestion is that animals must be protected from the very surroundings that sustain them. This misrepresentation of the natural environment as threatening to the health and well-being of these animals will not encourage people to understand, protect, and respect the animals or their natural environment. Bottom line, you cannot ignore evolutionary history. Now, this is a very interesting recent piece. I'm not going to read everything of this, but this gentleman is Simon Barrington. He's an esteemed professor of developmental psychopathology and autism. He studies humans. And the other day, he posted something that I thought was really interesting. He was talking about the notion of radical behaviorism. This notion that goes back to the 50s, 40s, and 50s, that you can take any kind of being and through the right series of reinforcements, negative and positive, make them do anything. And that this sense of equal potentiality was there in anything. So I don't have to know who you are, I can make you do something just by rewarding you at the right time and in the right way. And of course, we learned from a lot of experiments done with humans, in the wild as it were, that it fails miserably. You cannot ignore who people are. Well, he took this notion and he applied it to what we know now about orcas in captivity. And in particular, he was talking about Tillicum at SeaWorld Orlando. And this is what he had to say. So he's talking about Tillicum and he's applying this notion. He's saying the orca dutifully produced the behaviors to get the rewards, but over the years in captivity, he was involved in 3 deaths of people. It has never been documented that orcas have killed a human in the wild. So, this may have been a reaction to the radical behaviorists who were training this orca to show him behaviors whilst ignoring millions of years of evolved social and emotional neurocognitive circuitry in the animal's brain. Circuitry that does not just vanish in captivity. So what he's saying is, for all the marine mammal trainers out there, you have to consider who you're training and where they are. And if you don't, it's not going to work. He finally concludes the use of what he calls radical behaviorism, which is simply this notion of reinforcing and getting somebody to do whatever you want. The use of this technique towards such animals in captivity, he says, is doubly unethical because of its lack of respect for the animal's real nature. And that's really my point here. And the focus on shaping surface behavior and ignoring who the animal really is. And that's my take-home message is we need to know who cetaceans are, what they need to thrive, and respond accordingly. So, what should we do about it? Captivity doesn't work. Training them doesn't work on any but a superficial level. There's a fundamental incompatibility. And I think it's clear from the scientific evidence that cetaceans are harmed by captivity. Now, as a scientist, I always learned that when I get new data in from a study, I adjust to it. I don't just keep going on the same path. I say, that's interesting, and I say, okay, how can I change with that incoming information? We are obligated to adjust to new information, new data. That is the signature of a progressive society. That is the signature of the scientific method. So if you want to claim that you're scientists, then this is what you have to do. And to me, the captivity industry has ignored all of the data. They don't want to hear it. And therefore, they're not being scientific and they're not being progressive. And I could do a little thought experiment with you because this is how I see it. Imagine finding some doctors, medical doctors, finding that a particular chemical in a household was causing infant deaths, human infant deaths. And we decided not to tell anyone or do anything about it. That's what the captivity industry is doing. At this point, I think it's absolutely clear that there is overwhelming scientific evidence showing that captivity does not work for dolphins and whales. We also know that there are shifting public attitudes now with blackfish, with the cove, with also the denial of the Georgia Aquarium and SeaWorld's request to bring 18 wild-caught beluga whales into this country for display. Rejection of that proposal. And it's interesting, I was talking with Tom Wright last night, and he was mentioning to me, we're looking at attitudes now in the public, and I teach, 18 to 22-year-olds, right? And I realized that, college students, they get it. They know, they're educated, they know what goes on at places like SeaWorld. And guess what? They're going to have kids someday. And don't count on them taking their kids to those places in 10 or 15 years. So, this is my appeal. We can continue on the same combative paths. We can continue trying to win arguments, call each other names. We can continue to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money trying to win this argument when it's already been won in the scientific community. Or we can combine our expertise, our resources, our efforts, and create a paradigm shift, a new way of relating to marine mammals. This is an opportunity, this is a paradigm shift time for SeaWorld, the Georgia Aquarium, and the rest of the captivity community to be leaders, not to be ones that try to foil progress, but to actually lead the progress. And I invite them to do so because, quite frankly, you don't have a choice. It's already happening now with a number of other animals. Our relationship to them is changing. We know now that with chimpanzees, they are not being used for biomedical experimentation. They're being sent to sanctuaries. Our relationship with them, our respect for them has been changing. The same is going with elephants. Elephants are coming out of zoos. They're not going back in. Progress is occurring. So it's not just about dolphins and whales. It's about realizing who we are, who they are, and